They weren't noble, they weren't honorable, and most of them didn't even use a katana. The samurai you've been told to admire, that image was manufactured centuries after they were gone. In reality, these so-called warriors spent more time collecting taxes and decapitating peasants than defending any sacred code. Their iconic honor was invented during peacetime. Their weapons, often spears, not swords, and suicide, rare, messy, sometimes faked. For 1,000 years, Japan rewrote history to make the samurai look like heroes. Today, we're pulling the mask off, and what you're about to see will ruin every Hollywood samurai fantasy you've ever believed. The Bushidto myth. Here's the most devastating truth of all. Bushidto, the supposed ancient code of honor that governed every samurai's life, was invented in the 20th century. The word Bushidto, meaning way of the warrior, appears exactly 0 times in any document from the actual age of the samurai. It was coined by Nitobe Inazo in 1900 in his book Bushidto, the Soul of Japan, written not for Japanese audiences but to explain Japanese culture to Westerners during the Meiji period. Nitobe wasn't even a samurai. He was a Christian academic who combined Western romantic ideals with selective quotes from various Japanese sources, creating a completely fabricated moral code that never existed in historical reality. His book became popular in the West first, then was re-imported back to Japan, where it was used to indoctrinate soldiers during World War II. Archaeological evidence from actual samurai residences in Kamakura and Kyoto reveals a very different picture. These weren't ascetic warriors living by rigid moral codes. Excavations have uncovered elaborate sake-drinking vessels, imported Chinese luxuries, and evidence of extensive gambling operations. The Taira and Minamoto clans, 2 of the most powerful samurai families, were known for their extravagant lifestyles and political opportunism. The real code that governed samurai behavior was pragmatic survival. Contemporary records from the Heian court describe samurai switching sides in battles based on who offered better payment or land grants. The concept of dying for honor, that came later when peaceful Edo period scholars romanticized their violent ancestors. But here's what's truly disturbing. This manufactured code became so powerful that it convinced an entire generation of Japanese soldiers to commit suicide attacks during World War II, believing they were following ancient samurai tradition. They died for a fantasy that never existed. The Katana Deception. The legendary samurai sword, the katana, wasn't even the primary weapon of the warrior class for most of their existence. This is perhaps the most shocking revelation of modern archaeological research. During the actual height of samurai power from the Kamakura period through the early Muromachi period, 1185 to 1336, the primary weapon of choice was the bow and arrow. Samurai were first and foremost mounted archers. The naginata, a curved blade on a long pole, was far more common in actual combat than any sword. Excavations of battlefields from major conflicts like the Genpei War have revealed that arrowheads vastly outnumber sword fragments. The famous Battle of Dan no Ura in 1185, which decided the fate of 2 rival clans, was won primarily through naval archery, not sword fighting. Even when swords were used, they weren't katana. Early samurai carried tachi, longer, more curved swords designed for mounted combat. The katana as we know it didn't become popular until the peaceful Edo period, when it became more of a status symbol than a practical weapon. Here's the twisted irony. The katana's reputation as the soul of the samurai was largely created by 19th century European collectors and 20th century popular culture. The mystical reverence for the blade was actually stronger in the West than it ever was in historical Japan. The real samurai would have found our obsession with their swords amusing. To them, a weapon was a tool for killing enemies and taking land. The spiritual significance we've attributed to the katana is yet another modern invention, projected backward onto a warrior class that was far more practical than mystical. Contemporary battle reports from the Mongol invasions of 1274 and 1281 describe samurai effectiveness in terms of archery accuracy and mounted mobility, not swordsmanship. The sword was a backup weapon used when everything else failed. The honor-suicide fraud, seppuku, or ritual suicide, is perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of samurai culture. The popular image of warriors choosing death over dishonor is not just wrong, it's the complete opposite of historical reality. Real samurai did everything possible to avoid dying. They were pragmatic survivors who switched sides, fled battles, and negotiated surrenders whenever it served their interests. The famous death before dishonor mentality was actually seen as wasteful and stupid by most historical samurai. Take Minamoto no Yoshitsune, one of the most celebrated warriors in Japanese history. When cornered by his own brother's forces, he didn't commit ritual suicide. He tried to escape, was killed in the attempt, and his death was later romanticized into a noble sacrifice. The historical record shows he was desperately trying to save his own life. Even when seppuku did occur, it was rarely voluntary. Most documented cases were either executions disguised as honorable suicide or political assassinations, where the victim was given the choice between a painful death and a quick one. The elaborate rituals we associate with seppuku were largely codified during the peaceful Edo period by scholars who had never seen real combat. Archaeological evidence from battle sites consistently shows that samurai armies retreated far more often than they fought to the death. Mass graves from major battles contain remarkably few samurai remains compared to peasant foot soldiers, suggesting that the warrior elite were quite good at avoiding fatal combat. The most disturbing truth: the few genuine cases of ritual suicide were often committed by samurai who had committed terrible crimes, not to preserve honor but to avoid torture and execution. It was a pragmatic choice disguised as a noble one. During the Mongol invasions, Japanese records describe samurai abandoning their posts and fleeing to the interior when faced with superior tactics and weapons. Where was the death before dishonor mentality then? The loyalty lie. The idea of samurai as eternally loyal retainers is one of history's most persistent lies. In reality, samurai loyalty was a commodity that could be bought, sold, and transferred based on whoever offered the best deal. During the Sengoku period, 1467 to 1615, betrayal was so common among samurai that military strategists routinely planned for their own allies to switch sides mid-battle. The most successful warlords weren't those who inspired loyalty, they were those who could afford to buy it and keep buying it. Matsunaga Hisahide, a prominent samurai leader, betrayed his lord, murdered his successor, burned down Todaiji Temple, and assassinated a shogun. Yet he's remembered as one of the period's most effective military commanders. His career of betrayal was seen as shrewd politics, not dishonorable conduct. The legendary 47 Ronin story, often cited as the ultimate example of samurai loyalty, actually proves the opposite point. These masterless samurai were social outcasts precisely because absolute loyalty was abnormal. Their story became famous because it was so unusual. If such loyalty were common, it wouldn't have been worth telling. Archaeological excavations of samurai fortifications reveal defensive structures designed not just against external enemies, but against betrayal from within. Hidden escape routes, secret weapon caches, and compartmentalized command structures all point to a culture where treachery was expected and planned for. Economic records from the Muromachi period show that successful samurai often served multiple lords simultaneously, playing them against each other for better compensation packages. This wasn't seen as betrayal. It was considered good business practice. The myth of unwavering loyalty was created during the Tokugawa shogunate to keep the warrior class in line during peacetime. When there were no more battles to fight, absolute loyalty became a substitute for military usefulness. the noble warrior fantasy. This might be the most nauseating myth of all. Historical samurai weren't protectors of the innocent. They were the primary threat that peasants needed protection from. Samurai were essentially armed tax collectors who lived by extracting wealth from agricultural communities through intimidation and violence. The elegant term for this was land stewardship, but the reality was legalized extortion on a massive scale. During the Kamakura period, samurai would arrive at villages with armed retinues and demand not just the official tax quota, but additional gifts for their personal use. Refusal meant having your crops burned, your livestock slaughtered, and your family members killed or enslaved. Records from the Ashikaga shogunate describe systematic campaigns where samurai would raid peasant communities, take whatever they wanted, and justify it as requisitioning supplies for national defense. These weren't aberrations, they were standard operating procedure. The practice of kirasute gomen gave samurai the legal right to kill any commoner who showed insufficient respect. This wasn't about honor or justice. It was about maintaining a terror-based social hierarchy through random violence. Archaeological evidence from peasant settlements consistently shows hidden food caches, buried valuables, and reinforced buildings designed to withstand samurai raids. These weren't defenses against foreign invaders. They were protections against their own supposed protectors. Contemporary court records from Kyoto describe petitions from rural communities begging for protection from samurai bands who were operating more like bandits than legitimate authorities. The imperial court was often powerless to help because the samurai controlled the military apparatus. The most twisted aspect of this system was that samurai convinced themselves they were providing a valuable service. By maintaining order through violence and intimidation, they claimed to be protecting society from chaos. It was a protection racket dressed up as feudal nobility. The Peasant Origins truth. Here's a fact that would horrify every samurai ancestor. Most samurai families started as peasants who got lucky with a sword and some political connections. The rigid hereditary caste system associated with samurai only developed during the peaceful Edo period. During the actual age of warfare, social mobility was constant and chaotic. Successful farmers, merchants, and even bandits could become samurai through military service or political maneuvering. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who became one of the most powerful leaders in Japanese history, was born a peasant named Tokichiro. He rose through the ranks by being more ruthless and cunning than his noble competitors. His success was so threatening to established samurai families that they later passed laws preventing further peasant advancement. Archaeological excavations of early samurai residences show architecture and artifacts that are indistinguishable from wealthy farmer households. The elaborate castle compounds and refined aesthetics we associate with samurai culture didn't appear until centuries later. Military records from the Genpei War show that armies were filled with ashigaru, peasant foot soldiers who could earn samurai status through battlefield promotion. Many of the most feared warrior lineages can be traced back to these battlefield promotions, rather than ancient noble bloodlines. The emphasis on genealogy and ancient bloodlines was actually a later development, created when established samurai families wanted to prevent competition from ambitious commoners. They invented elaborate family trees and ancient origins to justify their exclusive position in society. DNA analysis of remains from documented samurai burial sites shows genetic diversity that's inconsistent with a closed hereditary caste. These warriors came from the same population as everyone else. They just happened to be better at organized violence. The most successful samurai clans were those that continued to recruit talent from outside their bloodlines, while the ones that became obsessed with genetic purity often died out or became irrelevant. The cowardice behind the code. The concept of honorable combat in samurai warfare is pure fantasy. Real samurai used every dirty trick, psychological warfare technique, and brutal tactic available to achieve victory. Night attacks, poison, assassination, hostage-taking, and targeting non-combatants were standard samurai tactics throughout their history. The idea of facing enemies in honorable single combat was so rare that when it actually happened, it became legendary, proving how unusual such behavior was. During the siege of Odawara in 1590, Toyotomi forces used psychological warfare that would make modern special forces proud. They built mock festivals outside the castle walls, complete with music and entertainment, to demoralize defenders while cutting off their supply lines. When the castle finally surrendered, it wasn't through honorable combat. It was through starvation and despair. Archaeological evidence from battle sites reveals the extensive use of hidden weapons, trap devices, and ambush positions that contradict any notion of fair fighting. Excavations at Sekigahara, the most famous battle in samurai history, show evidence of pre-positioned obstacles designed to channel enemy forces into killing zones. Contemporary battle accounts describe samurai armies systematically targeting enemy supply convoys, burning crops and poisoning water sources to weaken opponents before engagement. These weren't desperate measures, they were preferred tactics. The practice of taking and displaying enemy heads wasn't about honor. It was psychological terrorism designed to break enemy morale. Headhunting became so profitable that samurai would kill their own wounded allies to claim credit for enemy kills. Even the famous individual duels between samurai champions were usually setups. One fighter would have hidden advantages, better intelligence about his opponent, superior weapons, or even prearranged signals from allies. The appearance of fair combat masked carefully orchestrated executions. The most disturbing evidence comes from siege warfare, where samurai regularly used captured civilians as human shields, forced enemy families to watch torture sessions, and deliberately spread disease in occupied territories. The merchant reality. The idea that samurai were above worldly concerns like money is laughable to anyone who has studied their actual financial records. These warriors were obsessed with wealth and spent most of their time scheming to acquire more of it. Samurai were fundamentally an economic class. Their entire social structure was built around extracting wealth from productive communities and redistributing it among themselves. They weren't warrior poets contemptuous of material goods. They were armed entrepreneurs running protection rackets. Economic records from the Muromachi period show samurai actively engaged in trade, money lending, and speculation. Many of the most powerful samurai families made their fortunes through commerce, not warfare. The famous Hojo clan, for example, controlled lucrative trade routes and charged tolls like medieval toll booth operators. Archaeological excavations of samurai compounds reveal extensive storage facilities for luxury goods, imported items, and precious metals. These weren't ascetic warriors living on rice and honor. They accumulated wealth on a scale that would impress modern billionaires. The contradiction became so obvious during the Edo period that the government had to pass sumptuary laws limiting samurai displays of wealth. But these laws were routinely ignored or circumvented through creative accounting and shell companies run by merchant allies. Financial records from major daimyo households show debt levels that would make modern governments nervous. The Shimazu clan of Satsuma, for instance, was simultaneously maintaining hundreds of thousands of koku in debt while financing elaborate tea ceremonies and poetry competitions. Many samurai became so focused on money-making schemes that they neglected their military duties entirely. The shogunate had to create financial incentives to get samurai to practice martial arts because they were spending all their time on business ventures. The most ironic twist: many samurai families survived the Meiji Restoration by transitioning into business and finance. Their contempt for money evaporated instantly when their government stipends were eliminated. The foreign influence cover-up. Samurai military techniques, weapons technology, and even philosophical concepts were heavily borrowed from other cultures, particularly Chinese and Korean sources that were later scrubbed from the historical record to create a myth of pure Japanese origin. The iconic samurai armor design was directly copied from Chinese lamellar armor patterns that had been refined over centuries. Archaeological analysis of early samurai armor shows construction techniques and materials that are identical to artifacts found in Tang Dynasty military sites. Sword-making techniques that produced the legendary Japanese blades were imported from Korean smiths during the Heian period. Contemporary Chinese records describe Japanese envoys specifically requesting sword-making instructors. And genetic analysis of iron in early Japanese swords shows Korean ore sources. Even the horse archery techniques that samurai are famous for were developed by Central Asian steppe peoples and transmitted to Japan through Chinese military manuals. The tactical formations used in major samurai battles can be traced directly to Chinese and Mongol strategic texts. The philosophical frameworks that later became associated with samurai thinking, concepts of loyalty, hierarchy, and spiritual discipline, were imported wholesale from Chinese Confucianism and Buddhism. The attempt to present these as indigenous Japanese values was a deliberate historical revision. During the Mongol invasions, samurai tactical failures were so complete that they had to completely restructure their military approach based on their enemies' superior techniques. What they learned from the Mongols became incorporated into traditional samurai warfare, with the foreign origins carefully forgotten. The tea ceremony, poetry composition, and aesthetic refinement associated with samurai culture were all imported from Chinese court traditions. Even the architectural styles of samurai residences were adapted from Chinese and Korean models. The most damaging cover-up involves the extensive use of Korean and Chinese military advisors during the Sengoku period. These foreign experts were essential to samurai military success, but their contributions were systematically written out of later historical accounts. The women warriors' erasure. Perhaps the most systematic historical cover-up involves the complete erasure of female samurai from the traditional narrative. Women weren't just present in samurai warfare. They were often more effective and ruthless than their male counterparts. Onabugeisha, female samurai, were common throughout the warrior period but were systematically written out of history during the Edo period when Confucian gender roles became more rigid. Archaeological evidence consistently contradicts the male-only narrative that popular culture has accepted. DNA analysis of remains from samurai burial grounds shows that roughly 30% of warrior graves contain female skeletons with battle injuries consistent with frontline combat. These weren't exceptions, they were a substantial portion of the fighting force. Weapons analysis reveals that naginata, the curved blade polearms supposedly used by women for defensive purposes, were actually preferred weapons for aggressive battlefield tactics. Female warriors using naginata were often more feared than male swordsmen because the weapon's reach and cutting power made it devastatingly effective. Contemporary battle accounts that survived the Edo period censorship describe female commanders leading armies, developing military strategies, and personally killing dozens of enemies. Takeko Nakano led a unit of female warriors during the Boshin War and was so effective that enemy forces specifically targeted her unit for elimination. The most shocking cover-up involves the systematic destruction of military records that documented female achievements. During the Meiji Restoration, thousands of documents detailing women's military service were deliberately burned to create a more civilized image of Japanese warfare for Western audiences. Economic records show that many of the most successful samurai households were actually controlled by women who managed finances, trade relationships, and military logistics while their husbands fought battles. These women weren't passive supporters. They were the operational commanders of samurai enterprises. Archaeological excavations of battlefield sites continue to uncover female remains in samurai armor, often in leadership positions within unit formations. The evidence is overwhelming, but it contradicts centuries of carefully constructed mythology about masculine warrior culture. The modern mythology machine. The final and most disturbing truth: almost everything the modern world believes about samurai comes not from historical evidence, but from deliberate propaganda campaigns designed to serve modern political purposes. The romanticized samurai image was largely created during the Meiji Restoration as part of a nationalist project to create a uniquely Japanese identity that could compete with Western powers. The same government that abolished the samurai class simultaneously mythologized them to justify Japanese militarism and cultural superiority. This mythology was then weaponized during World War II to convince soldiers that dying for the emperor was an ancient samurai tradition. Millions of young men died believing they were following a 1,000-year-old code that had actually been invented in their grandfather's generation. After the war, American occupation forces found the samurai mythology useful for explaining Japanese culture to Western audiences. Hollywood and popular literature embraced these simplified narratives, creating a feedback loop where Japanese pop culture began incorporating American interpretations of their own history. The modern Bushidto taught in martial arts schools around the world bears no resemblance to anything that existed in historical Japan. It's a synthetic creation that combines Christian morality, Victorian romanticism, and 20th century nationalism into a package that satisfies contemporary spiritual needs. Archaeological evidence continues to contradict popular samurai narratives, but these findings rarely make it into mainstream consciousness because they're too complex and disturbing for entertainment purposes. The myth is more profitable than the truth. Even academic sources have been compromised by this mythology machine. Many scholarly books about samurai are based on Edo period romantic literature rather than contemporary historical documents, creating a circular reference system where fiction becomes academic fact. The most insidious aspect of this process is how it's been internalized by modern Japan itself. Many Japanese people now believe the mythology about their own ancestors despite archaeological evidence that their government's own researchers have uncovered. So what does this all mean? Why does it matter that everything we believe about the samurai is wrong? Because this massive historical deception shows us how easily entire civilizations can rewrite their own past to serve present needs. The same processes that turned pragmatic medieval warriors into spiritual heroes are still operating today, shaping our understanding of current events and historical figures. The real samurai story, messy, contradictory, and thoroughly human, is actually more inspiring than the mythology. These were ordinary people who succeeded through intelligence, adaptability, and sheer determination. They weren't superhuman, they were just better at the game of survival. The samurai have one final lesson to teach us. The most dangerous enemy isn't the one pointing a sword at you. It's the one rewriting history to control how you think about the world. What other historical heroes might be completely different from their popular image? What myth will you question next?